Hello gentlemen, and welcome to one of the final videos for Year 11 revision. This paper is your second paper. Well done for completing the first. We're going to go through some revision for migration to Britain from 1000 years AD to 2010. So we'll be looking in particular for who came, where did they come from, why did they come, what were their experiences like, and what was their impact over time. So the exam looks like this. Really short, 1 hour long. You have a 4 mark, an 8 mark, a 14 and a 24 mark, and we're going to delve into these a bit later. Of course we are. So my recommendations to you is for 4 marks you spend 4 minutes. For an 8 marks you're spending 8 minutes. For 14, I want you to extend that to 18 minutes, and for the 24 marker you should be spending at least 25 minutes with about 5 minutes to plan. Now the first question will be outline, the second question explain, the third question how significant or how important, and then the last question will be an agree. How far do you agree? For the 4 mark, 2 quick PE paragraphs, very quick. For an 8 mark, make a really good PIL paragraph. If you want to go on to have a second part, then fine, you can do. For how significant, you're looking for 2 solid PIL paragraphs that are balanced. That's the key part to that. You have to have on one side and on the other hand. And for the 24 marker, you should be aiming for an introduction, a conclusion, and for 3 substantial paragraphs at the very least. Now, that's not to say if you can write more than that, that you should be that you shouldn't limit yourself, but that's a good place to kind of start. So let's get into it then. We are looking at the British thematic study. We're looking at migration. Who came to Britain? Why did they come? What were their experiences? What were their actions? How did people in Britain respond to immigration? What was the impact on Britain? How did it change Britain's relationship with the wider world? I've broken it down into 4 topics. So the first section, migration in the Middle Ages. The second topic, migration 1500 to 1730. Migration in Great Britain, section 3. And migration in the 21st century. Go through these. These are your PLCs, your personal learning checklists. Do I know about the Norman Conquest? Do I know who came, why they came, etc.? If you don't, go to the relevant section of the video. I'm going to try and experiment with some tags so that you can do it a little bit more easily, and that will therefore set you up so to make sure that in the next 2 days you are revising the parts that you do not know. There is no point reiterating and revising the things that you do know. So let's get into it. An overview, migration in the Middle Ages from 1000 to 1500 AD. So at this period we're looking at the invasion of the Normans. We've got obviously the rule of William the Conqueror, and then the Plantagenets that follow. And it really goes all the way up until 1440. So some key areas, we've got the expulsion of the Jews in 1290, we've got the Hanseatic League, we've got Flemish weavers, foreigners, we've got the blood libel, the massacre at York, etc. In this period, who comes? Well, the first section, we've got the Norman Conquest. The Norman invaders, of course, they come to take control of Britain, successfully defeat the Anglo-Saxon king and the Danish king, and the Normans take over. They instigate huge amounts of change, and they start to invite other Normans over. So they took military, political, and economic control of the country. They experienced some resistance from the Britons, but anyone that did resist was dealt with harshly. And if you want to look at the harrying of the North, that's the greatest example of this. The Northerners of England resisted the rule of the Norman kings and were treated exceptionally harshly. So therefore, the experiences of Norman invaders, who are the migrants in this case, were very positive. As a result, all of the rulers claimed some legitimacy, but it was going to be a period of about 100 years where the Normans reiterate their control over England. Now, Jews in the Middle Ages from 1000 years AD to 1500, they came from all parts of Europe, and they were invited by the kings of Britain because they could lend money. They were therefore, Christianity and the Pope in the particular at this period, they were a Catholic country. The Pope declared that Christians could not lend money. The same could not be said for Jewish people. So they were invited by the kings of England in this time to come over and to lend money, including building churches and cathedrals and castles. They were useful to begin with, and so they were protected, but that soon changed, and we see persecution increasing, eventually being expelled in 1290. So if you've done your revision, you should know about the massacre at York and how that changes treatment of Jewish people from 1189 to 1290, all as a result of the blood libel of St. William of Norwich, who begins it. So by 1290, all of the Jews are expelled. They clearly had a significant change in Britain, and their impact was numerous. Jewish immigrants allowed for new skills, new investments, huge castles to be built, and the blood libel actually ricocheted across the whole of Europe. It resulted in thousands of deaths and hundreds of years of persecution. Now, the last group we're looking at is other European migrants in this period. Who came and why? Most people that came to Britain in this period were artisans. They had specific skills that were needed. They were craftspeople, and they came for work. And when they came for work, they were welcomed initially by the authorities. Some who came were refugees, some were wealthy merchants, and some were bankers. Their experiences was diverse. Immigrants dispersed throughout the country. They didn't focus in one particular area. Initially, they were treated very positively. Eventually, though, some of the guilds became threatened. There was violence, and there were some measures against the aliens. Britain's relationship changed significantly. War and trade drove immigration. Irish immigrants, for example, were forced to come to Britain because of English colonisation. The same with Gascony and Brabant. And of course, you've got the people like the Flemish weavers who came for trade. Flemish migrants had huge amounts of influence over Britain. They came from modern Belgium and the Netherlands, and they were responsible for skilled cloth making. And initially, up until the 1330s, they were incredibly well received. However, though, after 1330, there was hostility towards them as they were given special privileges by the king. Now, we could also talk about in this period, for example, Islamic influences. We could also talk about the Oriental immigrants, etc. So we've got a really diverse area that we can talk about. So in this period, we've got significant changes that happen. Now, in the second section, we're looking at migration from 1500 to 1730. Some of the key events, we've got the expulsion of gypsies. That's an incredibly turbulent time and shows clear disadvantages to immigration. We've also got the first recording of the use of blackamoor, which means a black person. In 1560, we've got the arrival of the Walloons. It's 1570, the Huguenots. Then we've got the reign of Elizabeth I, who closes the Hanseatic League. And then we go to 1642, which is a huge change and a revolution in Britain, the English Civil War. And we see Britain move very clearly away from autocratic rule by the king or the queen and moving towards a more favourable position for the middle classes. By 1660, that includes the Royal African Company being set up by Royal Charter, more Huguenots, and then the Bank of England by 1694, and eventually resulting in the Acts of Union between England and Scotland in 1707. And in 1709, we've got the arrival of the Palatines. Now, first of all, from 1570 to 1500 to 1730, we've got European immigrants who came. Well, we've got massive amounts of income, massive amounts of changes in this. The Reformation divided Europe between Catholics and Protestant states. England gradually became Protestant during this period, especially under the Tudors, and by 1600, it's solid. The 16th century, it's solidly Protestant. And of course that means that many people come to Britain as it's a safe place. There's Catholic persecution of Protestants, and so we get people like the Walloons and the Huguenots coming there. Their experience were initially welcomed and integrated, but again there was some tension and increase tension socially and economically. Impact was significant. European immigrants had a significant impact in this period. London starts to grow as a financial world trade centre. And that's very much due to the groups that come. Huguenots originally arrive as a result of persecution by French Catholics, and they start to come. We also have then in 1709 the Rhineland Palatines, who had a very different treatment. In 1709 the government passes the Foreign Protestants Naturalization Act. It allows all European Protestants to come and live in England with full rights at a very cheap price. And we see this period being a huge amount of immigration from the Palatines. At least 13,000 people come, and very quickly it's rescinded. There's a solution: deportation to Ireland, and of course the German Palatines are expelled. About 5,000 of them leave Ireland, with about 3,000 of them setting off to New York in America. We've also got the gypsies being expelled from Britain, and some Jews starting to return from about 1650 onwards. In fact, in 1655, a rabbi from Amsterdam goes to the Lord Protector Oliver Cromwell and begs for asylum, and it's granted. And we start to see Jewish communities arriving in this period. Now, in terms of other changes, we've got an increase in Africans in Tudor England. As I said before, we've got the first account of blackamoor in Britain, which is an incredible change. Now, Britain's relationship with the wider world affected immigration. Africans and Britain started to trade. We may have had some Africans come from, as a result of the marriage of Catherine of Aragon to Henry, and some Africans arrived as refugees, some from trade. There's been very small amounts of research that's actually been undertaken, so we don't know a huge amount about who arrived and why. Now, the early years of enslavement and empire is an important time as well. Britain again starts to change. We've got the start of triangular trade in this period. We've got the creation of the East India Company, and that has huge amounts of impact for Britain. Women, men and children from Africa and India start to live and work in England, particularly as servants. And we see that with the portraits, where it becomes fashionable to have a black slave or an Indian girl pictured with you in your portrait. Their experiences were varied, but evidence suggests that actually they live very similar lives to other people in their class, so no different from white people in this period. And of course, we've got the growth of Indian trade. So that's now our second topic dealt with. Now, our third topic is where things start to get more interesting. From 1730 to 1900, this is the period where Britain explodes onto the scene. It starts to become an empire, and it starts to have huge amount of influence within the world. And of course, we've got the Industrial Revolution as well. In 1730, we've got the City of London banning black apprentices, some of the negatives. We've got 1% of the London population being formed by Africans in 1760, and then we've got some of the beginnings and rumblings of the abolition movement. Obviously, in this period, the RAC start to ramp up trade and enslaves, and of course we have the negatives as a result of that. We've got the American War of Independence, where black people fight for the sides of Britain. We've got riots in 1800, and then we've got the abolition of the slave trade in British Empire. We've got slave rebellions, we've got the Merchant Shipping Act. By 1840, we've got famine in Ireland that has an impact. We've got the EIC and the Indian Rebellion, where India becomes part of the British Empire and no longer a public company. Jews being given full civil rights. The Yellow Peril in England by 1880. We've got huge amounts of European immigrants in 1881 and 1894. But most importantly, we've got the Merchant Shipping Act. So, initially for Black Britain, it's clear that triangular trade starts to mean more and more people come to Britain as a result of transportation. They may come with their owners, they may come as freemen, but more and more black people start to appear in Britain. Their experience is mostly living ordinary lives as working poor because they are not slaves. They cannot be treated as slaves. Some achieve status and some indeed involved in emancipation, particular people like Olaudah Equiano. We see the abolition movement grow as a result of them. They play key roles as activists. Abolitionists had a considerable impact on other people, and the majority of black people worked as domestic servants. We see the Somerset case in 1772, where in Britain it's decided that actually they are not slaves, they are not property, and we see black people fight on the side of Britain in the American War of Independence and the Napoleonic Wars. We've got individuals like Ignatius Sancho that you need to know about, as well as black radicals, and the creation of groups that start the Cato Street conspirators that started to contribute towards the growth of Chartism. And of course, by the end of this period, we've got the end of slavery, which plays a huge part. In terms of Asian arrivals, we've got merchant seamen. I can hear Miles laughing in the background. As the EIC expands, trade expands, control expands, and more seamen are needed. Large numbers of these were Asian. They're known as Lascars. They originate from India, from China, Malay, Yemen as well. They mostly live negative lives. They live in boarding houses that are owned by the EIC. They're segregated. They're paid less than white seamen. Multiracial communities, though, do start to grow, and we see that in Cardiff, in places like Boot Town. We see that in Liverpool, Glasgow, Hull, South Shields, London, etc. And really in this period we start to see the beginnings of multiculturalism. Now next up is the last European immigrants in this period. We've got Irish immigration as a result of the potato famine and other results. We see, for example, Belfast being industrialised, whereas London starts to become one of the largest Irish populations outside of Ireland. We've got huge amounts of immigration as a result of Scotland and the 1707 Act of Union. We've got black working class lives starting to come up. We've got eminent black Victorians like Lady Sarah Forbes Burnetta, Samuel Coleridge Taylor, and then of course we've got the growth of Chartism. We also see waves of Italian immigrants coming as a result. About 1.5 million left Italy to seek a better life. Some of them chose to go to Britain, and we see about 20,000 Italians in England and Wales, and about 5,000 or so in Scotland. We also have German immigrants, so people like the Barings, the Rothschilds, growth of the City of London, and that's very much as a result of Germans in particular. We also have Eastern European Jews, and that's an incredible part of the changes that happen in this period. Jewish people start to come as a result of the terrible treatment across Europe. They're fleeing violent pogroms. In 1900, for example, 3,000 walk all the way from Romania to Britain. So we see huge amounts of changes, and there are problems with assimilation. Some Jewish people find it very easy to assimilate into British culture. Some are more resistant. We see many Jewish people that had been living in Britain for centuries or for years, decades, encouraging assimilation and it not necessarily happening. We also see, though, immigration laws. We've got denization and naturalization. Denization is a letter granted from the king or queen. Naturalization is an act of parliament. We see asylum seekers start to creep in. Now, in our fourth section is the most modern period. We're looking at the 20th century and the 21st century. So we're going to look at the impact of World War I and how that really does change Britain's attitude towards immigrants. We'll look at the impact of World War II, and we'll look about the 50s, the 60s, the 70s and the 80s, all the way up until 2010. So there's some really key parts that you need to know. You need to know about the Alien Registration and the British Nationality Act, the internment of enemy aliens, the Aliens Act. These are huge changes to how Britain deals with immigrants, and it's immigration control. Whereas before we'd encourage them because of the economic benefits that they brought, we now start to see resistance to migrant communities. By the World War II, we have, the Lascars going on strike as a result of their unfair treatment, and these are people that fought on the side of Britain or certainly helped with the merchant shipping, and without them we would not be in the place that we are. Equally, we've got Polish resettlement. The Polish Resettlement Act is as a thank you to the hundreds of thousands of Polish soldiers that fought on the side of Britain and were instrumental in the defeat of Nazism. And then in the 50s, the 60s, with the backdrop of the economic downturn, we have huge growth in anti-immigration feeling, and we see that eventually coming towards with the Race Relations Act. So let's get stuck in. From 1973 onwards, again, we've got increases in the murder of Ali and Peach. We've got race relations again. We've got riots in Brixton and Tottenham, and then we've got the creation of the Schengen Agreement. We've got the increase of the European Union, and we've got the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. Now, the First World War has a significant impact on Britain, and it leads to race riots. We have the British Empire being at its height, but so is racism. In 1905, there are low levels of After 1905, there are low levels of migration. People come to Britain from all over the world. There are already settled populations of thousands of Africans, thousands of Asians, and thousands of West Indians as a result of merchant shipping. Some people just did not want to go home. They were allowed to stay. We've also got immigrants from other countries like Italy and Germany, etc. They have negative treatment as a result of the 1905 Aliens Act. There are new laws that restrict immigration. The 1905 Aliens Act said immigrants had to have enough money when they came to Britain to support themselves. Immigrants had to show they could earn a living. They were not allowed to have a criminal record, illness, or contagious disease, and they had to prove that they were refugees for a reason. Immigrants would not be allowed entry if they could not do this. It was a turning point. Britain no longer had an open door policy. Remember, between 1870 and 1910, there were 400,000 immigrants and 2 million emigrants, more people leaving Britain than actually arriving. In 1905, though, immigration was going to be restricted. Now, refugees, so for the impact of World War One, we've got the internment of aliens, the negative treatment of German people as a result of propaganda. We've got the contributions of migrants to the war effort. We've got huge amounts of merchants that are Lascars that are crucial in the transatlantic convoys. But tensions erupt as a result of this, and after World War One, we see riots in 1919 as a result of it, because black people have taken the white people's jobs. Now, in World War II, we've got refugees from Nazism. We've got a massive change in Britain's relationship with the world. Britain gives dominion to countries like Canada, Australia, New Zealand, white countries, whereas the other colonies that are black are treated very differently. Who comes to Britain? People, as a result of the Wall Street crash. Few people come to seek work in Britain. Men from West Africa stow away on ships. There are child refugees, there are Jewish refugees, there are Poles, Czechs and the French people, etc., all trying to escape fascism in Europe. One particular notable example is the Kinder Transport after the Kristallnacht, where we get Jewish children come to Britain, and Britain accepts thousands but could have done more, arguably. Some of them had positive treatments, but with the internment of enemy aliens, that's a clear negative. We've also got the strikes of the Lascars, and that's married against the black people's increase in the war effort. Now, notably here, we've also got Polish immigrants. In September 1939, Poland was occupied by Germany. Thousands, though, came to Britain. About 160,000 of them served in Britain's armed forces. They were responsible for winning the Battle of Britain, for example, and as a result they were given settlement afterwards. Now, our last topic is post-war Commonwealth. Obviously, Britain experiences huge amounts of change in this period. A massive decline in the empire, a massive change and increase in racism as a result of this, and immigrants start to help rebuild Britain. Now, I'm realising this video is going to go on for quite a long time, so read through this at your own leisure, and of course this one as well. Now we're going to get into some of the essays. So for a 4 marker, it should be really simple. 2 points and evidence. So as you read through this, some of the markers that I'm using, one way, for example, another example, try and flesh it out, but you should not be writing more than point evidence, point evidence. For the 8 marker, you want to be going into a bit more detail, certainly more so than I've done here, but try and write a peel paragraph where you have your point, you supply evidence to support that, you explain very clearly how that answers the question, and then you try and link it back to the question. Now, I've underlined migrant communities because this is asking you for plural, for more than one. So up until the LTQ, I have only talked about one example, and that will limit the amount of marks that I get. But it's got a good amount of detail, it's in depth, it gives examples, it's clear. Now for your 14 marks, the ones that we really want to be nailing and doing as well as we can in, I'd be expecting 2 really good paragraphs at the very least. And actually, if you've got 15 minutes, you should be trying to aim for a little bit more. Now you can use peel, or you could choose to use ideal as a method as well. So for example, we've got our peel paragraph. It can be argued, firstly, arguably, additionally, etc. Try and have a balanced answer. It is so important that you're including contrary statements. So on the other hand. Now for our last question, how far do you agree with the statement? Again, we're going to go into so much detail with this. You need an introduction, or at least an introductory statement, and you need a conclusion that comes to a judgment. Try and have considerable amounts of paragraphs that show change over time, chronological change, etc. Okay, so that's all from me. All I can say is good luck. You have 1 hour Do not spend any more time than about 12 minutes on the first two questions. I would highly recommend that you start with the 24 marker, then the 14 marker, and then the 8, and then the 4. If you do not finish the 4 marks, so what? You lose 4 marks. If you do not finish the 24 marks, you will struggle to get above 15 out of 24. Have fun, and I look forward to speaking to you.